Ever felt like a stranger at your own kitchen table?
Here is the sentence I never thought I would say out loud, let alone to someone I like and trust enough to sit across from and actually tell the truth without dressing it up to make myself sound stronger than I felt at the time. My husband left me for my own brother. And they laughed in my face, and what stung was not just the leaving or the laughing. It was the easy way they acted, as if I should have seen it coming and almost owed them a round of applause for choosing honesty over secrecy, as if that branding could wash the dirt off the way they did it. I am not going to pretend I handled it with graceful silence, because I did not. I paced the kitchen for what felt like an entire season. I called my friend and said every bitter thought a person thinks when their whole life gets turned inside out. I looked at our wedding photos and wondered if my eyes already knew something my mouth could not say, and then I did what people do when the shock wears off and the humiliation tries to settle in like a tenant. I started paying attention to the details that actually matter when you are about to be the odd one out in your own home. I learned very quickly that they wanted a performance. They wanted me to scream or make a scene or give them a villain they could point at when they told the story later to people who did not know me, and I refused to hand them that script. So when they showed up together at my parents' house and did that thing where they held hands in a way that makes sure every set of eyes tracks the interlocking fingers, I smiled like I was bored. I asked if they had found a place to live. I asked who would be paying the car insurance since it was always under my policy, and I asked if they had thought through the taxes because saying you are in love is different from filing jointly, and I did it all in that calm, practical tone that always irritated my brother because he hates paperwork and hates being reminded of it even more. While they smirked and said things about chemistry and fate and being brave enough to be honest, I was texting my lawyer to confirm the separation date and the immediate freeze on discretionary spending from joint accounts, and I will not lie, hearing the words, "that freeze is in effect today," felt like being handed a set of car keys after walking for miles in cheap shoes. There is a part of me that wanted to throw a glass at the wall and say a string of words that would not be printable on any polite page, and there is a part of me that wanted to ask 1,000 questions that never get answered in a way that satisfies anyone. But the part of me that won is the part that knows attention is a currency, and I was done spending it on a pair of people who found entertainment value in my pain. So I paid myself in privacy and control instead, which sounds cold until you have stood in a room where your husband and your brother do a bad impression of star-crossed soulmates, while your mother avoids your eyes and your father pretends the game on television needs his full concentration. I am not saying I was a saint. I was strategic, which to me was the only version of self-respect I could reach for in that moment. So I did the small, unglamorous things that make a real difference later. I moved my direct deposit. I canceled the family phone plan I had always paid. 4. I removed my name from every automatic bill that would keep their lights on while they practiced looking triumphant. It is strange what people choose to flaunt when they are trying to prove they made the right decision, and I watched the flaunting begin almost immediately. Little posts with soft captions about peace and authenticity. Group photos at cookouts where they stood too close and grinned too wide. A new gym membership we could not afford 3 months earlier now treated like a sign from the universe that everything was aligned, and through all of it I kept my mouth shut. Because words were expensive. And mine were going to be spent exactly once and at the right time. What I did say, in a private message my brother later tried to pretend he never read, was simple and plain and cost me nothing to write. You have made your choice, and I will live with it, and you will live with it, and there is nothing more to discuss. Which sounds like a door slamming, but was more like me flipping a deadbolt on my own side and giving myself the first good night of sleep I had had in months. You want the hook, the part people lean in for, the part where the audience decides if they are staying for the whole ride or if they are going to scroll past and pretend none of this could ever happen in a family like theirs. Here it is. And I am going to say it the way it happened without decoration because it does not need it. When he laughed in my face and told me I would be fine on my own because I was always the strong one and women like me land on our feet, I smiled like a person who has just discovered a quiet lever under a crowded table, and I pulled it by doing something he did not understand in the moment. I notified our bank of marital waste. I submitted the records I had kept of his spending during the months the affair was active, and I asked for an emergency partition that locked down the remaining savings until a judge could sort it out. which meant their weekend of celebration turned into overdraft alerts and phone calls they did not want to make. I did not shout, I did not gloat, I did not even answer when my ex called from a number I did not recognize and left a message asking how I could be so petty, because I was not being petty, I was being precise. And precision is the language you use when people have tried to convince you that your feelings are the problem. By the end of that week, I had a place lined up that did not smell like our old life, my name alone on the lease, and my boxes labeled in a way that made sense to me and no one else, and I was already practicing the thing that would carry me through the next stretch of time. The thing my therapist later called radical indifference, which in plain terms means I stopped trying to explain myself to people who had already decided what story they wanted to tell, and I started listening for the pieces that would matter later. The employer who owed my brother a favor, the cousin who knew about a loan, the insurance card that was still in my desk drawer because I was the person who always handled enrollment and renewals, and the thought of them learning the system without me made me almost laugh for the first time since everything went sideways. So when I tell you I did not retaliate that day with fireworks and a speech, believe me, I chose a smaller kind of revenge that hits harder because it keeps working long after the crowd goes home, and it looked like this. I took back what was mine. I cut off the pipelines I had built with my own hands, and I left them standing on the stage they had built for themselves with the lights still on and no one behind the curtain to run the sound, and the quiet that followed was not empty, it was packed with consequences they had not priced in. And, because I know you want to know where this is going, I will drop the first thread you should keep in your hand as we move forward, the one they could not see because they were too busy laughing. He has always hated doctors. He has always ignored the follow-ups. And there is a piece of our family medical history that I have kept updated because someone had to, and the person who kept it is the same person they decided they did not need, which is why. When the phone finally rings one night, and the voice on the other end asks for help from me, not from a parent, not from a friend, not from a stranger, there will be a pause long enough to feel like a lifetime, and then there will be my answer. If you want to know what rebuilding actually looks like when the crowd has gone home, and the headlines in your own head have stopped screaming long enough for you to hear yourself think, it is not a grand speech or a makeover or a weekend retreat that promises a new personality by Monday. It is a stubborn list made late at night and rewritten in the morning. It is calling the bank again and waiting on hold without hanging up. It is buying groceries with a calculator and deciding you can live without the fancy coffee. It is telling yourself that being alone is not a punishment when you chose it, and that privacy is a gift when you fought for it. And it is noticing that the first time you laugh at something dumb on television without forgetting to breathe afterward, there is a tiny part of you that trusts you will be fine even if the world never apologizes for what it took. I worked, not in some glamorous lightning strike of success, but in hours that stacked like bricks. I took the contract shifts others passed on. I said yes to the boring assignment that always leads to the steadier offer. I kept my head down when I needed to and lifted it when it was time to ask for better pay. And piece by piece the math stopped being a threat and started being a plan, which is the quiet difference between surviving and living, because when the bills are paid by money you earned on terms you negotiated, other people's opinions begin to sound like background noise instead of orders. I did not cut my family off, because I am not a door slammer by nature, and because leaving a mess to grow behind a closed door is not the same as cleaning it. So I took calls from my mother even when the topic circled back to understanding and forgiveness in a tone that always sounded suspiciously like a demand for my compliance. And I listened to my father do his careful neutrality routine that pretends to be wisdom but mostly protects his comfort, and I went to the birthdays and the cookouts and the holiday dinners where the new couple performed their harmony like they were auditioning for a part none of us asked them to play, and I nodded like someone who had found the off switch for reactivity, because I had, and because I was busy collecting something more useful than anger. I kept a record, not a courtroom binder with color tabs and a revenge soundtrack, just a living document where I wrote dates and remarks and small facts that matter later when people try to rewrite the past. Who paid for what? Who promised what? Who forgot the promise the minute it became inconvenient? And I added things that are not dramatic but are powerful. Like the reminder that the old urgent care across town still has me listed as my brother's emergency contact because I was the one who filled his paperwork during the year our mother had surgery, and he could not be bothered to sit in the waiting room and answer his own medical history, and that when they called last spring to confirm details. I corrected everything but that line, not because I was plotting, because I was tired of fixing their chaos for free yet wise enough to recognize that sometimes the universe leaves a lever in your drawer, and all you have to do is not throw it away. I chose small, sharp forms of payback that looked like ordinary administration to anyone not paying attention. So when the accountant I used for years asked if I still wanted to file jointly for the quarter we ended together, I said no and I brought receipts. Literally, and I signed an amended return that removed deductions they had planned to claim on my work and returned them to their rightful owner, which was me, and, because math cares about accuracy and not feelings, a refund they had already mentally spent on matching gym memberships vanished into a letter that used the phrase balance due, and while I did not dance, I did make myself a decent dinner and slept without the old habit of arguing with ghosts in my head. I moved my number from the family plan. I closed the store card where I had been the primary, and he had the authorized user slot he swore he never used. I transferred the extended warranty on the appliances in the old house into my name, and then sold them with the blessing of the original receipt, and I told the cousin who runs the small dealership that if any favors were going to be handed out this year, they would be handed to people who did not treat me like a joke when my life cracked open. And he nodded without asking for the backstory, because he has eyes and ears and a memory. There were days I did not feel noble. I felt angry and petty and tempted to post things that would have earned 1,000 gleeful comments from people who love mess, but I kept most of it to myself, because I wanted the wins that last longer than an online afternoon. So I did therapy even when I rolled my eyes at words like boundaries. I worked out even when I did not care about endorphins. I learned how to say no without a paragraph of justification, and in the middle of all that I found a new rhythm that did not include checking their pages or asking mutual friends for updates, because their lives were not my homework anymore. The first real measure of progress was not a number in my account. It was the morning I realized I had not thought about them for hours, and when their names finally crossed my mind, they did not take my peace with them. And if you have ever had to detox from obsession, you know that is a miracle you build, not a miracle you are given. Since you asked for the kind of revenge that makes an audience breathe out a satisfied yes, without needing a speech to explain why it counts, here is the one I allowed myself at the end of the stage. I sent a short, polite email to the gym that had been so thrilled to plaster their faces on the member spotlight board. I attached documentation showing that the automatic debit they were using had been tied to the account I had closed. I included the line that any future attempt to pull funds from an account with my name would be treated as unauthorized use and reported accordingly, and then I copied my ex on the message with a single sentence that read, "Take care of your own tab," which is not cinematic, but it is clean, and it is permanent, and it taught them the first small lesson of the many still coming. And, because every steady climb needs its coming storm to remind the audience why the climb mattered, I will tell you the last thing that happened that month, and then I will stop. A nurse from a hospital I did not recognize called my phone and asked for me by my maiden name. She said she was confirming the primary contact for a patient whose chart still listed me as responsible for medical history and allergies. She said the patient was my brother. She said this was just a verification call and not an emergency, and I said of course, keep it as is, which I did not do out of malice. I did it because when people tell you are unnecessary and then life disagrees, you do not argue with life. You simply let the file stay open and wait for the moment everyone swore would never arrive. If you have never lived through the bizarre performance of people who wronged you acting as if they deserve applause for surviving the fallout they created, then you cannot imagine how surreal it is to sit in a family living room and watch your ex-husband, who is now also your brother-in-law, lean back in his chair with the confidence of a man who believes the world forgave him simply because he declared himself happy, and beside him sits the woman who once called herself your sister-in-law through marriage, and now wears that same title in another context, smiling with the forced brightness of someone who knows she has stolen something that was not hers, but has rehearsed the lines so many times that she believes the audience will forget the theft. They flaunted it relentlessly, not with subtle moments that might suggest they were trying to avoid rubbing salt into wounds, but with loud jokes about how much freer life is when you stop pretending, with photographs strategically placed online where mutual friends could not avoid them, with the smug energy of people who confuse shamelessness with bravery. And though I sat through those moments without rolling my eyes or storming out, inside I was building a catalog of every single display, a library of evidence that I never advertised, but that I knew would matter one day when the laughter finally went quiet. It was not only their behavior that dug into me, it was the silence of others, the way relatives who knew exactly what happened pretended that harmony mattered more than truth. That it was better to smile at barbecues and nod politely than to acknowledge betrayal so deep it reshaped the family forever, and in those silences I learned a kind of patience I had never practiced before. Because anger spends itself quickly, but observation builds interest, and I decided that if they wanted me to look like the bitter one, then I would deny them that satisfaction and instead perfect the role of the quiet observer who misses nothing. Every family dinner became an exercise in endurance, listening to stories of their vacations, their new furniture, their carefully chosen details about promotions or raises, the subtle digs about how much calmer life is when you find the right person. Each sentence designed to land like a dart, but dressed up as harmless conversation, and though it burned, I always replied with a bland smile and questions about the food or the weather, because indifference is not weakness, it is training, and I was learning to hold my power until the right moment. They thought I was powerless, and that miscalculation is what carried me through the long years of their flaunted happiness, because I knew that power is never lost, it is simply stored. And I was storing mine like someone stacking wood for a winter that others are too arrogant to believe will ever arrive. I heard about the new car they financed, and I quietly remembered the cousin who worked at the dealership and knew the real terms of that deal. I saw the photo of them smiling at a ski lodge, and I remembered that the travel credit card they used still traced back to the account I once managed, with reward points I had earned. I listened to their complaints about insurance premiums, and I kept the thought to myself that my name was still on the emergency contact records because bureaucracy forgets only what you erase, not what you endure. They lived loudly, but I lived carefully, and careful always outlasts loud. It was during one of those suffocating evenings, when my father's patience cracked enough that he muttered something about wishing people would stop bringing their drama into family gatherings, that I realized the shift was beginning. Because the very relatives who once excused their behavior were starting to resent the constant parade of proof that they had made the right choice, since real happiness never needs that much advertisement. My brother's laugh was louder but thinner, my ex's smile was wider but less convincing, and though no one said it out loud, I could see the fatigue in the room when they launched into another story about their bliss, as if the family had grown tired of clapping for a show that never ended. That was when I understood that time was working with me, that I did not need to force anything, because all I had to do was keep my records, protect my sanity, and wait for the crack in their armor that arrogance always delivers. And then the call came, not from a family member trying to gossip or from a mutual friend hoping to stir drama, but from the kind of voice that never plays games, steady and clipped and professional. A nurse from a hospital whose name I recognized only because I had driven past it 100 times on my way to work. She asked for me by name, my maiden name, and confirmed that I was still listed as the primary contact for my brother, who is now a patient under their care. She explained that he had been admitted with complications that required immediate attention, and she wanted to verify details of his medical history. Details I alone had updated year after year because no one else could be trusted to keep the records consistent. For a long second I said nothing, because here it was, the lever I had always known would appear, the moment when their endless laughter and flaunting collided with reality, and I was the person the system trusted, not them. I told her yes, keep the file as it is. I confirmed the details she asked for, and I hung up with a calm I had not felt in years, because I knew the balance of power had just shifted, and though they did not know it yet, the season of their flaunting was over. When the call finally came from someone in the family who could not keep their voice steady, I knew before they said the words that the tide had turned, because people who once spoke to me with a tone of superiority, people who believed they had secured a permanent victory at my expense, do not suddenly start using words like please and we need you, unless the ground beneath them has cracked in ways they cannot control. And as I held the phone to my ear and listened to the trembling explanation that my brother was in a hospital bed with tubes and machines doing the work his body could not manage alone, I felt the strangest mix of cold vindication and quiet hesitation. Because while a part of me wanted to relish the irony that after years of laughter and humiliation I had become the person they desperately needed, another part of me still carried the history of being the one who stepped up when no one else would, the one who filled out the forms and tracked the appointments, and knew exactly which doctor to call when things went wrong. They said he was weak. They said the doctors were asking questions that his wife could not answer. They said I was the only one who had ever kept the files straight, and though they tried to dress the request in politeness, beneath it I could hear the same assumption that had always lived in their voices, the belief that no matter how badly they treated me, I would never refuse to clean up their chaos. I did not rush and I did not soften, because this was not a moment for sentimentality, it was a moment for clarity, so I asked pointed questions about what exactly the doctors needed, about what information was missing, and about why his wife, who had once smirked at me across family tables and made jokes at my expense, was now incapable of doing the very work she claimed I had never been good enough to manage. They hesitated, they fumbled, they admitted that she had no idea what medications he had taken over the years, no idea about the allergy that had once sent him into a terrifying reaction, no idea about the genetic risks that ran in our bloodline. And in that hesitation I could almost hear the walls collapsing around them, because the performance of superiority cannot survive when reality demands confidence. I told them I would think about it, and before they could argue or beg I ended the call, because power tastes different when you are the one who has been starved of it for years, and I was not going to waste the moment by giving them what they wanted too quickly. The next day I did go to the hospital, but not as a broken woman grateful to be included, not as a sister desperate to be acknowledged, not as an ex-wife clinging to scraps of dignity, but as someone who walked into the building fully aware that she was the only person in the room holding the information that could make the difference between order and chaos. When I entered his room, he looked smaller than the man who once sneered at me while holding the hand of the woman I loved and trusted, and beside him sat that same woman, her eyes ringed with exhaustion, her face pale with fear. But even then she tried to muster a smile that suggested control, a smile I knew was nothing but habit. The machines hummed, the monitors beeped, and the silence between us carried the weight of years, until she broke it with words that were meant to sound humble, but landed like the last desperate cards of someone who finally realized the game was lost. We need your help. I let her sit with that sentence. I let her taste the irony of it. I let the memory of every smug glance and every cruel comment hang between us, and then I answered with a calm that came from years of waiting for exactly this reversal. Of course I'll help. The look on her face told me she believed she had won again, that I was still the same woman who had been despite everything, but what she did not understand was that agreeing to help did not mean surrendering. It meant positioning myself at the very center of their crisis. It meant gaining access to every detail and every decision. It meant turning their desperate need into the lever I had been quietly waiting to pull. I provided the medical history. I gave the doctors the information they required, and I did it with precision, but I also made it clear to everyone involved that without me the puzzle could not be completed. And I watched as the truth settled in their eyes that the woman they once treated as disposable had become indispensable. That week was a blur of phone calls, paperwork, consultations, and updates, and through all of it I remained steady and composed, while they unraveled in fear and guilt and exhaustion, clinging to me not out of love or respect, but out of necessity, which was better. Because necessity leaves no room for arrogance. Every time a doctor turned to me with a question, and not to them, every time a nurse confirmed details with me instead of with his wife, every time the chart was updated because of something only I knew, I felt the balance of power shifting. Not in small increments, but in tidal waves, until the same people who once laughed in my face now looked at me with eyes full of quiet dependence. And though I gave them what they needed to keep him stable, I never let them forget that this access was mine to grant and mine to withhold. And the realization that their survival in that moment rested on the woman they had humiliated was the kind of justice you cannot buy, only earn through endurance. So when I tell you I agreed to help, understand this. I did not do it out of kindness. I did not do it to prove I was better. I did it because true revenge is not about walking away with a door slammed. It is about standing in the very place where they once thought you had no value and forcing them to acknowledge that without you, they are lost. And though the story does not end in that hospital room, that was the moment the laughter finally died, because nothing destroys smugness faster than the sound of your own voice asking for help from the one person you once swore you would never need. By the time the case manager asked for a family meeting with billing, the attending, and whoever could actually answer questions without guessing, I understood that this was the room I had been walking toward ever since the day they laughed in my face. Because hospitals do not care about swagger or social media or performative happiness. They care about signatures, contact names, medication lists, allergy histories, primary guarantors, and the exact person who can give a straight answer when something goes sideways in the middle of the night, and I was the only person in that circle who could do all of that without pausing to check a phone or look around for help, which meant the air in the room tilted toward me before I even sat down. I placed my folder on the table, not with drama, but with the calm of someone who had earned the right to be listened to, and I told the team exactly what they needed to know to keep my brother safe for the next stretch, the childhood reaction to a common antibiotic that almost stopped his breathing, the family incidence of clotting that shows up after a period of immobility, the name of the cardiologist who had warned him in clear language that skipping follow-ups was reckless and whose notes I kept because someone had to keep them, and as the nurse charted while nodding and the physician ordered tests that should have been ordered days earlier, I watched my ex and my brother realize in real time that the woman they reduced to a punchline had quietly become their lifeline, which is not forgiveness and not malice, it is leverage. I did not make them beg, and I did not make them grovel, because this was never about humiliation for sport, it was about restoring balance and extracting the truth in a way that could not be spun later. So I slid a single sheet across the table when the medical pieces were settled for the day, a plain agreement written in clear, boring language that would make any lawyer smile. And I explained in the same even tone I had used with the doctor that two things had to happen for me to remain in the loop. First, they would sign a written acknowledgement that during the last year of my marriage and the first year of their relationship, funds, points, and benefits tied to accounts in my name were used without my consent and would be repaid on a schedule already attached. And second, they would sign a public statement to be sent to the family group email retracting the story that I had been vindictive, unstable, or dishonest during the separation, replacing it with a factual sentence that I had handled the paperwork, the bills, and the emergencies they were never willing to face, and that from this day forward they would handle their own. The case manager blinked, the social worker did not even try to hide a flicker of approval, and my ex tried a familiar trick, a half smile and a joke about me always loving paperwork, but the joke died when the attending, who had no interest in our history beyond its clinical relevance, said in a dry voice that the hospital needed a single competent point of contact until they hired a professional care manager, and that the woman with the folder had just proved she was the only one qualified. They signed, not because they wanted to, not because they suddenly respected me, but because they finally believed that I would walk out if they refused and that the hospital would let me, and I would have, not out of cruelty, but out of self-respect that had been rebuilt one boundary at a time until it could carry my full weight, and once the signatures were down and the copies were scanned and emailed to my attorney, I handed the team every record they needed. I scheduled the consult with a specialist who would actually address the root problem instead of chasing symptoms, and I watched color creep back into my brother's face as oxygen numbers climbed into a range that let everyone exhale, because vengeance does not require a body count. It requires a reckoning, and the most efficient reckoning is the one that saves a life while rewriting who gets to stand at the center of the story. The public part happened the next evening, not with a spectacle, not with a broadcast designed to ignite a bonfire of comments, but with a short, simple message that I drafted and they sent from their joint address to the same relatives who had clapped for their happiness for years. A message that said I had been the person keeping the boring parts of life running, and that they had let the truth get bent in ways that served their pride, and that they were correcting the record. And when the email went out, I watched three things unfold at once. The replies from cousins and aunts who had suspected as much and were relieved to see it in writing. The stunned silence from the few who had enjoyed the show too much to think critically. And the immediate shift in my parents' tone, not into holiness or sermons about forgiveness, but into the quiet respect people reserve for the adult who shows up when it counts. I did not gloat. I did not add commentary. I did not forward it with a victory lap. Instead, I followed with a second note addressed to the hospital team, naming a professional care manager I had vetted, transferring primary responsibility to the person they would pay, and removing myself as the emergency contact with a final, efficient sentence that said the family would now handle their own affairs. There was one last lever, and I pulled it with the same precision I had used from the beginning, because while they were sending apologies and arranging payments, a clerk at the courthouse stamped the filing on my petition to recover marital waste. Backed by the ledger I had maintained in long, unglamorous hours, and a judge signed a temporary order that protected the remainder of what was mine from any last-minute raids disguised as confusion, which meant the vague sense of consequence that had hovered over them hardened into reality, payment plans, asset returns, and the end of free rides masquerading as fate. And when my ex called to ask if we could talk like adults, I said we already had and that everything else could flow through email. And then I blocked the number without ceremony because closure is not a conversation, it is a decision. So when people ask me later whether I forgave them or whether I regret anything I did in those weeks, I say the same thing in a calm, even voice that never shakes anymore, that forgiveness is not a currency I owe to people who only understand bills coming due. That regret is a luxury reserved for those who had choices and used them well, and that what I did was not cruel, it was accurate, and accuracy was exactly what the situation had avoided for years. I saved a life because I could. I protected my own because I had to. I took back my name because no one else was ever going to hand it to me, and I walked out of the hospital in the evening with the sun low and my phone quiet, not because everything was perfect, but because the final move had already landed. The agreement was signed, the truth was documented, the debts were structured, the responsibility was where it belonged, and the door I closed behind me did not slam in anger, it clicked in place like something built to fit, and it stayed shut because there was nothing left inside that I needed.